Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another Infinite Loops. Today is going to be a very special day on Infinite Loops because my friend, Tom Morgan, is my guest again. I think you all know Tom. He's the Director of Communications and Content. Oh my, how I hate that word, content, for KCP Group. But what he really is a knowledge seeker extraordinaire, but more importantly, a synthesizer of said knowledge, who I think is one of the best that I've seen. I read him religiously and always love to have him on as a guest. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for such a lovely invitation. Coming on this the first time was honestly one of the most fun things I've ever done. And the response from people shooting me emails from all over the world, 100% of them nice, was completely unexpected and has just been an extraordinary way to live over the last couple of months.
Excellent. I'm so happy to hear it. All right, Tom, I'm going to give you the floor for maybe the next 15 to 20 minutes because you're going to outline a pretty interesting and in-depth series of thoughts that you and I have discussed via email, in person, etc. But we mutually agree the best way for you and for me to let this unfold naturally is to let you explain where you're at. So, my friend, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I absolutely hate people monologuing on podcasts, but I think there's really no other way to do this. I've spent the last 6 or 7 years synthesizing ideas. And as I've always said, literally none of these ideas are mine. There's 2 ways to do synthesis. There's either you start off with a big block of marble and kind of chip it down until you've got Michelangelo's David, something that's intrinsically true, or you start with something that's incredibly false and just find confirmation bias to build it up to something that's still untrue but makes even less sense. And I think I've done option A, but I might have done option B. So I'll lay out the ideas as they've come to me, and then after that, we'll take them apart one by one. I think I can only get away with something this grandiose because none of them are my ideas, but this is really about the meaning of life and saving the world. And what's weird is that they are one and the same thing. Kind of a fun place to start is Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. It obviously puts me at a certain age by having seen it. And if you haven't seen it, go out and see it. But there's a scene where Indy is looking for the burial place of the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And he's using this medallion. And the Nazis, in their classic rationalist format, only have access to one side of the medallion. And he has access to both. And he's able to dig in the right place and they're digging in the wrong place. And I just think of that as a fun metaphor for people using both sides of their brain, the intellectual and rational, and sort of the creative and intuitive. And I know that's an oversimplification, but I'll come to that in a minute. But what's been really fun for me, as you and I have been thinking about the way the world's going to play out from here and what's important, and that reconnection back to the sacred that I think we're all craving, If you ask intellectuals for their forecasts, you're going to get either a linear extrapolation or a shruggy emoji. One of the key takeaways that I've realized over the last 4 or 5 years is that if you want to predict the future, look at the stories that people are telling, because the artists are first to every trend. And if I was to say, what should you read? It would be, one, the stories, but it would be the people that have analyzed the stories. Joseph Campbell, even though he's dead, is probably the best forecaster that there is right now. And I wouldn't say read The Hero with a Thousand Faces, because I'm on my second read right now and I find it literally impenetrable. That's the ingredients that he's assembled. But the dialogue with Bill Moyers, The Power of Myth, is extraordinary and one of the best things I've ever read. And the reason why this is interesting is that I think the stories reflect what people want from their inner lives. And they don't change over time. We've always wanted the same thing. But what happens is that the trends ebb and flow. And I think about the world's most competitive environment for stories that there ever has been right now, with the amount of content, the word you hate, that is being produced by every single channel and is competing for our attention. So the stories that are winning doesn't always mean something, but sometimes it means something incredible. And Joseph Campbell was most famous for the monomyth, which is the hero's journey, which is this narrative arc that existed across time and culture. And I think a lot of people look at it and they're like, hero faces adversity. And I'm like, no. It's this really complicated 15 to 20 stage process that you see in all of the most resonant stories of our time. Star Wars, The Matrix, Harry Potter, Avatar. And in fact, 13 of the 20 highest grossing movies of all time are explicit monomyths. I think the reason why that blows me away is that the monomyth is actually about how individuals and societies evolve. So you can tell me the stories don't mean anything, but it's really, really weird that at a time of transition that I think we're both at, the dominant story is a story about how societies evolve. And that's like an insight that gives me chills. And I think stepping back for a second and returning to an anecdote from nature that we discussed on my first podcast about ants, that basically ants go out and they find a food source and then they lay a pheromone trail to that food source so everyone else can find it. But then every so often ants will peel off that trail to go and find new food sources. But the rate at which they peel off is directly correlated to the uncertainty of the environment around them, implying that there's some form of signal or knowledge that they get that their environment is deteriorating, and then something else that tells them to go into exploration mode. And you can look at that as a random process, but I think that's a pretty limited perspective. And I know that you and I are totally obsessed with this book, The User Illusion. And I'm not going to paraphrase the whole thing, but the relevant piece is that we probably are aware of 60 bits of information at any given moment, but there's 11 million that are potentially available to us. If I say to you, wiggle your big toe, you're suddenly aware of your big toe. That information was coming into you all this time. You're having a conversation at a cocktail party with one person, and you hear someone else across the room say your name, and you swivel your attention to that. You were taking that information in somewhere. It just wasn't being served to your conscious awareness. It's a filtering process. That feels like something that's kind of intuitive and is easy for us to understand. The bit that took me a really long time to understand is the idea that outside of that 1,000,000 to 1 ratio, there's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 ratio of things that we're never aware of and never can be aware of. When you think about an earthworm has never seen a sunset, and it will never see a sunset because it has not evolved to see a sunset. We will never experience the way a bloodhound does with 200 million receptors in its nose because it's not relevant to us. The reason why that's important is that if you think about a 1,000,000,000 to 1 ratio of things that are outside of us to things that we're aware of, the idea that there wouldn't be a force influencing us that was hidden goes from a possibility to, I think, a probability. And this is what unifies the user illusion and the ant analogy. And this, I think, just proves how staggeringly unoriginal this idea is, because it was the subject of a blockbuster. It was Chris Nolan's Interstellar, which is an extremely explicit monomyth and is a brilliant movie. When I first saw it, I was like, that's good. Weird sound mixing, can't really hear the dialogue, but pretty cool. And then I started digging into it, and the environment is deteriorating. There's crop blight, the same as the ants noticing their environment deteriorating. There's the call to adventure, which Matthew McConaughey's character experiences through the watch in his daughter's room. Unfortunately, I'm going to spoil the rest of the movie over the course of this talk. So turn off the podcast now if you haven't seen it before, because it's a great movie. But basically, there's a scene in the movie with Anne Hathaway where she talks about there's all these available planets for them to find their own salvation. And there's a man that she used to love and still does love on one of the 3 planets. And she describes to Matthew McConaughey's character that love is this thing that exists beyond time and space and is tangible in kind of the way that gravity is. And I heard that and I thought, that seems fairly hokey, particularly because of the connotations of love in our society. And I think that's sort of a linguistic problem, that we have this very limited conception of love, particularly in the West. On your previous podcast, I talked about how Sanskrit languages have 96 different descriptions of words for love. But the idea here is an incredibly deep one, which is love as a driver of exploratory attention. I'll explain what that means. So the other book that I mentioned on your first podcast was Ian McGilchrist's Mastering His Emissary. And he talks about the 2 sides of the brain controlling 2 different kinds of attention. And he uses the metaphor of a bird, that a bird uses narrow attention of the left hemisphere to distinguish which is a piece of gravel and which is a piece of grain. And then there's exploratory attention, which is looking out for cats. It's the piece of your attention that's listening for your name at a cocktail party, whereas the narrow attention is the thing that's having a conversation with the person that you're speaking to at that time. The really interesting implication is that exploratory attention, because it's much, much more connected to your body and the outside world, is also connected to something that we experience as love, and is something that is mediated by the heart center, follow your heart, heart's truth, all of these different metaphors that we keep using throughout our society, but don't really seem to give any credibility. And I think about the way that this was told in our very, very earliest story, one of our very earliest stories, which is the Genesis myth. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, in this continuous flow of reality, they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and they fall, which I think is a metaphor for our ability to abstract ideas, which has been the source of all our power. We can communicate like we're doing right now, but it abstracts us away from the experience of life and that glorious flow and love. And then the very next story in the Bible is about Cain and Abel, the warring brothers, which I think is a metaphor for our conflicting hemispheres, where Cain is divorced from God. His sacrifices are not understood, much like how our left hemisphere ego does a bunch of things and we don't understand why we're not getting rewarded for it. But Abel was. And there's a line in the Bible that was the subject of an entire book from John Steinbeck, East of Eden. The key word is timshel, which is thou mayest. You have the ability to choose. And I think the relevance to this discussion is that when you're orienting yourself through space and time, you have the choice of making something with a relatively narrow egoic decision or something that's much more connected to the world around you in sort of this Taoist flowing way. And this is where the idea, I think, gets crazy, if it hasn't got too crazy already, which was this concept that Jung had, which was that your interests somehow directed you through time. So what you loved and what you were drawn to unstoppably would be the best source of your future growth. And I think that's an unbelievably powerful idea. I raised it on our previous podcast. And I was like, is this explicitly talked about in Interstellar as well? And I'm like, well, it is. There's a bit when the hero throws himself into the black hole and he exclaims, it's love, Tars is the name of his robot, that allows him to communicate back through time and put the coordinates in the watch so that his daughter can find the equation that saves the world. And I think this is sort of a metaphor for the ability of our own interests and our own love for things to signal a direction of future growth. And I think that speaks to the limitations of our left hemisphere, which only knows what is currently around us. Joseph Campbell talked about following your bliss, which is exactly the same concept, which is he said that doors were open when previously there were only walls, which is, of course, that would happen because your right hemisphere has access to at least 1 million times more, if not 1 trillion times more information, because it's being guided by whatever we perceive as love. And this is where things get very, very, very difficult. The idea of following your bliss sounds very easy. But one of McGilchrist's key insights was that the left hemisphere is fundamentally competitive. It does not relinquish control. It stands for everything that keeps you safe, everything that society says you should be. And getting through that is almost like swimming through the football field of crap that Andy Dufresne needs to get through in Shawshank to get to the other side. You do literally have to face your greatest fears to follow your bliss. That is the dragon that Joseph Campbell was talking about through all of this. But the implication from Taoism is that if you manage to surrender to your interests, your life would work out better than any other way. It just wasn't going to work out necessarily in the way that you expected it to. And I think of a funny example from a guy, Michael Singer, who wrote a whole book about this. He tried to meditate himself to enlightenment. It wasn't working out. And so he just said to himself, I'm going to go with these binary decisions. Cain or Abel, Tim Shaw style decision every time someone asked me to do something. And he ends up founding a company, taking it public and being worth $200 million. So it's not to say that money is always inconsistent with this spiritual growth, but it is saying that if you pursue something that's abstract, you'll end up in the wrong place. I think to sort of bring this back home to the hero's journey, the only original idea I thought I ever had was that the hero's journey was a metaphor for this hemispheric transition, where you give the right hemisphere and love and all this broad awareness, the steering wheel, and you surrender. And then I read this book by Jill Bolt Taylor, who had this incredibly famous left hemisphere stroke at the start of this year. And she's like, oh yeah, that's totally what the hero's journey is about. And I was like, oh crap. Okay, I haven't even had an original insight. The last thing I'll say on sort of this whole idea, why does this mean you save the world? Why do all of the monomyths end with the hero saving the world? Well, I think the first example is the ant. The ant comes back with a new route to food. He says, guys, it's over here. If you follow this pheromone trail, you will get new food. And he saves everyone. And I think the implication here is also an important warning, which is if the ant comes back from the food and says, worship me, everyone starves. He is offering a direction for other people to go in. But the idea being that the ant has gone outside of the existing paradigm, he's found something, and then he's communicating to everyone else. And I think the thing the Taoists realized that is staggeringly optimistic is that if an individual rediscovers his own creativity, he manages to subjugate his ego to this love, he doesn't know how he's going to influence the system. But if he co-creates with it, he can become like a butterfly in a typhoon. He can subtly influence it. And if everyone finds a way to do this, the whole system starts to move. But like a piece of sand in a sand pile, one single person bringing an idea through can change the whole model. And I think an interesting literal historical example of that is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who basically used his time in the Gulag in Soviet Russia, suffering to, in his words, basically purify his own soul. He comes out and basically says, I'm not going to go along with the lie anymore. So he writes the Gulag Archipelago, and it contributes considerably to bringing down the entire Soviet Union. So this guy acts as a butterfly in the typhoon, and he does it by coming back to the rest of the tribe and telling the truth, like the hero returning with the boon. A topic that I know you're super interested in is prophets and heretics. Heretics are people that overthrow an existing power structure. In this case, the ego in the left hemisphere and the society that it now dominates. It's a very, very dangerous place to be. But the prophet is someone who goes outside and says, guys, there's truth out here. There's something that's real. And in this case, it would be love, that there's a guiding intelligence that's bigger than us, that if you can surrender to, it's an incredibly benign force. The one thing to come away with is that if you follow your attention and you follow your interests, your environment will start to signal back to you that you're in the right direction. It will start to offer you coincidences and synchronicities, that there's this reciprocal exchange of gifts that's very, very, very opposed to the Western ideology of sort of every man for himself. And I think we're slowly shifting away from that. There's a bunch of other crazier, much crazier directions I can go in, but that's sort of the thesis as I see it. Come at me.
Well, I think you know me well enough to know that I share a lot of your ideas. It's something that has sort of consumed my entire life, really. I started reading Lao Tzu when I was 18 years old, and I started actually understanding what he meant when I was about 55 years old, because I think that one of the challenges that we face is that we are a linguistically oriented society. And oftentimes words obscure rather than illuminate. And I think that what you are talking about, by the way, I honestly cannot believe that you have not read Jed McKenna, because When you do read Jed McKinney, you are going to love this guy and you will not shut up about him. I swear, because you are distilling many of his ideas with your thesis. Also, Anthony DeMello, also Persig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There are so many examples of awareness. Again, linguistically, when you say spiritual, people hear that word based on what their label machine inside their brain attributes to that word. And so it's a rule of thumb, it's a heuristic, and they make sense in 75% of the cases of our everyday life. You use these simple rules of thumb so that you don't have to fucking think about every single thing you're going to do. But the 25% where they're wrong, they're really, really wrong. And they can get you into a mode where you are literally putting a blindfold on yourself, not knowing that you're doing that. I think that you are hitting on themes that go all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece. I'm reading a series of books right now where it's talking about the development of the global brain, and not just with humans. Bacteria, of course, were the first to develop a global brain. They were around for like a couple 100 million years before we even decided to get out of the ocean. By the way, like ants, they do the same thing. Bacteria, on the other hand, are able to literally change essentially their own DNA genes to find and or to exist in this new environment that they find themselves in. And of course, it's not just ants, it's bees. The bees do the same thing. When it looks like their situation is deteriorating, bees go out and look for new sources, and they come back and they actually do a dance that the other bees understand and follow them. Termites, same thing. If you ever go to Africa, look at the termite hills and have somebody there who's an expert in termites, because it will blow your mind how incredibly sophisticated and advanced termites are. So I guess my starting premise here would be, yep, you're right. The challenge that I see is threefold. First off, so I use the phrase the great reshuffle. You call it a phase change. Those are two fundamentally different things. So what I'm talking about is the far more pedestrian. My 1-year-old granddaughter is here visiting. So I was holding her and looking at her, and I like to imagine, what is the world that you're living? What's that going to look like? So that's my goal with the Great Reshuffle series. It's like, this is what I think, and it's speculation, and I'm probably going to be wrong, but it's at least a stab at looking at that world. A phase change, as you use the term, is a really different thing. A phase change is literally, in my opinion, a step in our evolution. And then you've got to be reading people like Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, Bucky Fuller, all of those people, because that was their obsession. And what's interesting too, Plato was talking about this stuff. He was wrong, in my opinion. He decided that his consciousness was the charioteer, but of course he did, because that's what he knew. And now you'll see a lot of our metaphors and analogies to computers. Well, of course, it's very easy to understand. But on the phase change angle, I have some interesting thoughts. So first off, you're too young to know this. This is the part that sounds weird, and people just go like, what are you smoking, man? But literally, it is a change in the environment and or the collective consciousness. I don't care what you want to call it. I've always said the ground straight reality is what the majority of humans alive at any given time believe. And that you've got to also understand that probably the majority of those beliefs come to them from long dead humans, and that they believe them because they're convenient, quite frankly. You can come out and you can have a shrink wrapped, right off the shelf belief system, and you can be very happy in your life. And yep, there's God in the heaven and Satan's down below, and I'm going to be a good boy and I'm going to go to heaven. It may lead to a very happy life, but not a life where you uncover any truths, in my opinion, because I think that most of that, everything began as a marketing campaign. The deeper you go into all the various religions, and I'm not saying this to be nasty to religions, is their command and control structures. And if I was going to be running a society, I'd have 10 commandments too. I might even have 15. Because when you go through the various commandments, not just to pick on Christianity, it's just one of the oldest. Interestingly enough, from what this book I'm reading, and I never knew this, Christianity was the first religion that memified beliefs. And Paul, who used to be Saul before he fell off his horse and suddenly saw the light, had, I can't remember, I guess it was 138 precepts or whatever. But the key thing was, it didn't matter what tribe you were a member of. It didn't matter what color you were. It didn't matter where you were born. So therefore, Christianity was, in effect, the world's first global religion. They accepted converts to their faith from anywhere, any tribe, anything, which is, I think, interesting. But back to phase change. So mid-60s to mid-70s, the easiest way to see this is watch the music videos from that time. Again, the artists. The artists were at the forefront. They were the tip of the spear in this. And the spear scared the shit out of the left-brained dominant society, the man, so to speak. Psychedelics were broadly being used, misused in many cases, but all of the elements required for a phase change to happen successfully were in place in the mid-60s to the mid-70s until the man, in this case, Richard Nixon, and I'm speaking pretty specifically about the US here, but it happened in the UK too, and it happened in Germany, and it was a global phenomenon, but the man, the conventional keepers of the social truths, in quotes, shut it the fuck down. And they did that because they could. They did that because back then, there was no global communication network like we have today. In the United States, there were 3 networks that they could control completely. They did control completely. People, for example, didn't know that Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. They did not know that. Can you imagine in our day and age, even trying to comprehend that is wild. So they were the keepers of the, in quotes, truth. And it was a narrative that everyone believed and ascribed and held to. And they were able to shut that phase change down because it was frightening. I think that's an aspect that you do touch on, which I think often people don't, which is this is scary as shit, this stuff. I love Bucky Fuller's line that there's nothing about a caterpillar that suggests a butterfly. And yet it's the death and rebirth cycle of every Enlightenment thinker I've ever read. All of them have a death and rebirth. So does the hero's journey. So does, literally anything you're going to read about. You go all the way back to the oldest myths, when it was goddesses, by the way, not gods, who were doing all of the dying and rebirthing. It is part and parcel to that storyline. So I think that time, that phase change got shut down because they could shut it down. And of course, this is just amazing to me. They made drugs, almost all of which are the non-addicting drugs, illegal, Fed max prison for going. They made an example of Timothy Leary. He became the scapegoat for having a couple of joints in his pocket, I think. They didn't even get him with any kind of psychedelic. You've got to remember, this guy was a tenured professor at Harvard who was a well-thought-of psychologist. They made an example of him because, now this is getting into kind of my take on this. People are terrified of what the implications are for being free. And this is not a conspiracy, by the way. Society wants us all to be good little boys and girls and to play by their rules. Those rules evolve over time. And anyone not playing by those rules, the heretics, the prophets, the jesters, and what you in the UK would call the tall poppy syndrome, they get cut down because no, you can't be like that. So I think that probably the most controversial thing that is part of your thesis is the idea that love is the answer. The challenge that I find there, and then I'll shut up because I'd be interested in your response to several of these things, but the challenge that I find there is I think that, again, we just have the wrong idea of what love is globally. Again, listen to the music, read the poems, read the novels. Many of them is love, as you can understand, is a basic human thing. But I think the guy who got it the closest was, again, Tony DeMello, who was, in my opinion, awake. He was enlightened. He wouldn't give himself that term. He would say that he was aware. Big difference. I think the Buddha said the same thing when they asked him, are you a god? No. Are you a semi-deity? No. Are you a man? Yes. But what are you? And he said, I am awake. DeMello says, I am aware. But then he challenges you, because what DeMello says is the source of all sorrow is our illusions coming into conflict with, in quotes, reality. A Taoist would say our illusions coming into conflict with the Tao, with the way. And if you're a betting person and you want to put a bet on the Tao winning or your illusions of your beliefs winning, I'm going to bet on the Tao. But what DeMello was so good at was pointing that out. He was very good at saying the primary source of sorrow is your illusions. If you get rid of your illusions, you can be happy. I think happiness is a byproduct. I don't think it's an end in itself. But back to love. Just think of every one and one of your favorite rock songs about love. And they're all, oh, I need you so much. Without you, my life is nothing. You completely. And so DeMello says you should be able to say this. If you truly love someone, truly, he said, you should be able to say to them, I love you. I leave you free to be yourself, to indulge your taste, to follow your inclinations and behave in any way you decide is to your liking. Whoa. Because basically what he's saying, if you can't say that, you're a clinger, exploiter, conditional person. If you do this, then I will love you. If you don't do this, then I will not love you. And I'm putting words in his mouth here. But DeMello basically says, how fucking dare you? How dare you make some other person responsible for your happiness? It is the ultimate in being unenlightened, in being so deeply asleep that you can't understand. You're beyond almost redemption because you are saying you are going to be the one who makes my life good or bad. No. I think if I've learned anything, and probably I haven't, but if I've learned anything, it's that I am the only person responsible in my life for me and for my life. Can I help the change that you were talking about in your original thesis? Absolutely. Oh, you bet. But can I compel Tom to see things the way I think the way Tom should see them? No, because that is, in my opinion, the lowest form of being able to coerce someone. There's a great passage in the Tao Te Ching about this, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's along the lines of the greatest leader makes the people feel that there is no leader, that they've done everything themselves, and that the worst leader is the one that makes people afraid of him or her and mets out consequences for your actions. Yeah, of course there are consequences for all of our actions, and we should all know that, but it shouldn't be, in my opinion, for someone else to determine. I'll stop there and get your take on suffering as a result of your clashing with reality. Reality is the Tao, and by the Tao, I mean the eternal Tao, the unnameable Tao. We're back to a place where our words fail us because our words can't describe what that is. Music, maybe. Drawings, certainly. I love your take about artists being the leading edge, because I think that is absolutely correct. I'm left-handed. Everyone would say, well, you're left-handed. Make the normal joke. The Romans called that sinister. And I said, yes, but I am the only one that is in my right mind. What do you think?
Let's step back for a second. What are we talking about here? What do I mean by phase change? I don't even know if I'm using that term right. That's how dumb I am. But what I think of when I think of the phase change idea that I've stolen from a million different sources is the idea of the Kung Kalahari tribesmen in Africa, where they dance and they dance and they dance, and they get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, which seems to be a metaphor for the way the world's going right now. It's getting hotter and hotter and more connected and faster and faster and faster. And at some point, cross a threshold, a state that hasn't really been integrated into Western culture in any meaningful way, where the ego structure dissolves and their heart opens. And I think about this heart opening all the time. I was on a run yesterday and I thought to myself what Superman does when he opens his shirt. He pulls open his shirt and there's the Superman logo beneath it. And I think that movement, although it's probably a coincidence, it's kind of the source of our societal superpower. And it's really interesting to me how Iron Man, it's always in his chest. Spider-Man, it's on his chest. That's where our superpower lies. And if we can connect from our head to our heart, again, I'm using sort of horrible cliched terms. The words annoy me as they come out of my mouth because they're so insufficient. But what's interesting is that when you do actually end up getting an embodied heart sense, which for me was only possible through having completely come apart for the first time in my life. In my 40s, I know what's true. So people can make really, really smart, incredibly internally consistent arguments to me. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's true. I'm not sure I'm right, but I know what I believe for the first time. And I think that when you apply that to a whole society, so many of our problems have been about us not feeling connection to anything solid. No connection to anything true. Think of the idea as love, whether this proves correct or not, is something we're receivers for. We may receive it in horrible ham-fisted ways. We may not receive it at all, but it's that sense of disconnection that then gets steadily better. And if you think about love as sort of the force from Star Wars, this binding agent that we're receptive to, that guides us in this infinitely intelligent way, if our heart opens, we get better at accepting that kind of guidance and we start to achieve a direct experience. And I think it's very, very, very easy, too easy to crap on religion. You can look at the fingers and be like, well, that finger's really dumb. But actually, they're all pointing at the moon, and the moon is what's important, and the moon is the same for every religion. I think if there is a criticism of organized religion, it's that maybe that they've tended to abstract us away from direct experience. You had Brian Murarescu on your pod, and I think his thesis is fascinating, that there used to be some form of mediated direct experience to the spiritual world, whether it's through plant-based medicine or something else, which has been a semi-ubiquitous feature of almost all other cultures that's helped ground us in the world around us. And I think that's one thing you said is that I think the modern conception of spirituality is like higher consciousness. I think that's an awful, awful way of putting it. It's almost lower consciousness. It's more integrated consciousness, where you're like, I'm going to put what I want to one side and let whatever's guiding this entire system take broader control. Because the only thing that you'll get if you try and make a 5-year plan is anxiety, because we can't control the world. And you'll notice that the more you try and control it, the unhappier you get. In terms of separation, I think of the example of Brene Brown. She studied shame, which is tribally interpreted as a sense of disconnection. It's associated with Cain and Abel, the idea of being thrown from Eden and then the shame of disconnection. If you're mega depressed, it's almost one of the only emotions that you can feel, which is this sense of deep, deep worthlessness and insufficiency that prevents you from manifesting the self that you probably should be. When she realized the only way to get that connection back was through unavoidable vulnerability, she had an 18-month nervous breakdown, a horrifying nervous breakdown. And I think that's maybe the last thing I want to say about the death and rebirth point, is that the thing you realize, particularly once you read McGilchrist, is you can't have safety and vitality It's a trade-off. You can't have them both. And at the moment, we've optimized for safety at the cost of vitality. And if you want vitality, you have to A, give up certainty. You have to give up the certainty of what you want, and you have to give up all forms of security. But not all forms of security. I don't want to overstate this. Everything's in balance, perfect balance. We've just gone too far in one direction. And I think that's sort of the prescription. It doesn't involve a huge societal meltdown. It just involves more of an awareness, own vulnerability, and our own holistic inclusiveness.
I agree, especially with the last part about certainty. I think I believe that the only one who is certain is a madman. It's in our base code, Tom. People crave what I call the illusion of certainty so much that it is so out of balance. And so it strikes your theme as well. It is so out of balance with the way one should live one's life that you will have no vitality. And of course, that goes right back to Lao Tzu. That which is young and supple bends and does not break. That which is old and brittle breaks. It is the theme of the Tao throughout. It's that life is energy, life is flow, life is movement. And then he uses water as a metaphor so often because I put up a quote. You know how I do the 2 quotes every day, the 2 thoughts from? So I put up one from a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, Thales of wherever. And he was mentioned in this book I'm reading. And so I kind of went back and looked up his stuff. One of the quotes I chose, which is really kind of fun, which is the entire universe was born from water. And then I appended it with another one of his quotes, which are, everything is full of gods. It's not like we haven't been thinking about this as human beings forever. We have. We let traditions, and I'm not anti-tradition, but I am opposed to traditions which have ossified and are not serving us anymore. And it's like our school system. It's like the main central heart of the great reshuffle. All of those old systems are broken or breaking, and we need to make new ones. And making new ones is going to be scary, but the only way you do that is to understand vitality, movement, and not be brittle, because what is brittle breaks. On the religion thing, I would say that many of the traditional religions do, in fact, not advocate you having a direct experience. In fact, there was a big kerfuffle over that very thing when good old Martin Luther knocked up on the church walls all of those precepts, because he thought that people could have a direct experience with God, or whatever we want to call God. We could call it the universal intelligence, the Brahman, whatever. Whereas the Catholic Church at that time, and even to some extent of now, thinks that that needs to be intermediated, that only through the priest or priestess can you reach God. Not so much, according to those other religions. So I think that, and here we are again in a challenging place because of terminology. I love the idea that I think is really absolutely true, which is if you get so out of balance that you just see everything from this one point of view, you are so limiting your scope that you're not going to be able to make good choices. The idea of co-creation, I very much believe in. That requires you, though, letting go, as Zorba would say, letting go of the rope and being free. And that's scary as hell. But that is the only way if you want to flow with the Tao, for example. It's the only way you can do it. The only way you can do it is to understand how ridiculously stupid you are, and understand that there are forces in the universe that maybe we humans will never fully comprehend. And the minute you do that, it's really interesting. Terence McKinnon had a great quote, which is along the lines of, the universe loves courage, man. If you dare and you really mean it, and you strike forth, very much with the hero with 1,000 faces type thing, and you jump into that abyss, you're going to find that it's filled with cotton. I'm butchering his quote, and I can't remember the name of the poet, but as a lunatic, I memorized 100 poems when I was a teenager, and it came in handy for two things. The first, you would probably know what that was for. But the second was, it was good because it gave you context that you could allow you to synthesize things because you had it in your memory. But I can't remember the poet, but it starts out goes something like, the world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending. We lay waste our power, little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. And I'll look up who wrote that later. But, honestly, sometimes people will say to me, what's the best way to do X? I'm like, read a lot of poetry, read a lot of literature, listen to a ton of music, and understand that you are probably wrong. But anyway, the reason I do that is, listen, I have no monopoly on truth. The one thing that I think, and I don't know if you're doing this, but I think that it's hard to find a grand theory that is going to fit everything. Physicists have been trying to do it forever, and they're forever being knocked off by new research. Like, I thought I had it. We think we know about history, and then they discover a mummy that is 10,000 years older than we thought. I always try to balance my much more intuitive side with the more practical side, because I think that only in a balance, it's Walking on the Razor's Edge, which, by the way, is a great book. If you have not read that, I would recommend it. That isn't the title. It's The Razor's Edge. It's by Maugham, I think. Anyway, I think that if we do anyone any good, if they're listening to this podcast, and all of the people who listen to our podcast are self-selected, I'm not selling anything. You're not selling anything. All we're doing is saying, hey, what about this? What do you think about this? I'm sure that 80%, and another great Jed McKenna quote, if you went and said your theories, Jed's theories, to all of your friends, what would they say? They would look at you and say, you're a real dipshit. So you've got to also not care. And that is another thing that we are programmed to not be like that. It's kind of a life's work to reprogram and metaprogram yourself.
So let's look at that again. You've talked about how there's no sort of overarching theory of everything. And I think that, what the hell am I going to know, right? Like, I'm not Stephen Hawking or anyone those guys. But I think
by the way, I think he was wrong.
Yeah. I think any kind of reductionist theory is always going to be incomplete, right? You can get to the Higgs boson, but the Higgs boson isn't going to tell you how to live your life. Right. You need values for that. I think there are actually universal values. They may be expressed in the 10 Commandments or something like that, but there is some sort of metaphysical truth out there. But the root to that individual creativity, that way you co-create with the environment around you, that I think is intrinsically unique. And that sounds incredibly saccharine because it's like everyone's special, everyone's got creativity inside them. Again, terrible words. When I heard creativity, I would have thought finger painting. When you talk about reading poetry and listening to songs, and that just annoys my intellect. You have to remember is that your intellect is fiercely resistant to all of these ideas because it requires it giving up the steering wheel. But what you do need to be is actually practical, because spiritual regressiveness and spiritual bypassing gets us nowhere in the same direction. So you need to be looking for people that are building the bridge. And I think in this case, it's people that are building the bridge from science back to spirituality. That's why I love McGilchrist. How do you do it in your life? There's a million different ways. It's the topic of almost every spiritual text. What did I do in my own relatively insignificant life is that without knowing I was doing it, I basically assembled a bunch of meaningful quotes. And then I turned it into a book. And then when I finished the book, I realized that I was the thread running through those quotes. And I was writing something about it this week. And someone reached out from Switzerland who had heard the first Infinite Loops podcast and was like, you should listen to this podcast about people unconsciously using quotes to signal their direction in life.
Was that Arnold Vandenberg?
Yes.
I talked to him. I love that guy. I love him. Amazing man. But continue.
This is exactly my point, right? Is that you hear resonance. So the resonance comes from outside of you, but it's your resonance with it that's important. That, I think, is how you start to build that bridge. And I think the other thing that's staggeringly universal and came out in John Cleese's recent book and almost every study of a genius I've ever encountered is that they cultivate these boundary spaces between the hemispheres, where for Edison, it was the boundary between waking and sleeping. And it's the same for me too. Or you go and take a cold shower, and that puts you a little bit more in your body. Or you do breath work, and that gets you a little bit more in your body. But there's all these different places you can go that take you into a boundary. Whereas, like, yes, you can go on a Vipassana retreat. I think we kind of over-egg that in the other direction. It's all about just getting things a little bit more in balance rather than this wholesale swing back the other way. And I think that's one thing when you talk about the 60s getting out of control, is that one, it was on a completely different scale to today, but also it kind of had this hedonistic culture when actually I think a lot of the plant medicine is supposed to be medicine. It's supposed to be sparingly used when you're in real crisis. And that's what makes today's movement different. It is coming at things from a fundamentally healing perspective, which makes it very hard to shut down. But you do have this interplay that is probably necessary between the priesthood and the Prometheans. Is that the Prometheans steal fire, everything goes haywire for a little while, everything gets burnt down, and then the priesthood comes in and shuts it all down. They come in at 4 a.m. and close the party down. That probably needs to happen. But at the moment, we don't have enough of that chaotic spark in the system, which we would ordinarily experience through vitality. And I think that's what we're coming back to now.
That's a great way of putting it, I think, Tom. So I'll tell you a personal experience. When I was young, when I was a teenager, I was, and I don't know why, I was amazingly hooked into resonance. And by that, I mean, the classic example I'll give was I'm the youngest by 7 years. I have a brother who's 7 years older than I am. And the youngest of my sisters, 9 years older than I am. So I was like kind of an only kid, but I had this big family. Obviously, as I grew older, I became much closer to my sisters and everything. But so I was 16. And the youngest of my sisters was at my house. We had a big house. And I was walking in from the garage, and they were at the most distant point in this very large house, a living room. And I was hit by what at the time I called a wall of emotion. It was like literally you were in a blast radius. The minute I opened the door, I felt like almost knocked over by this. I later learned that my sister was telling my father that she was going to divorce her first husband. But I want to tell you the reaction that I had. And that was, I was terrified. I'm not in control here. In other words, when that happens to you, you experience that kind of resonance for the first time. Honestly, I spent the next 5 years trying to deaden that. No, I don't want that. I don't want that. And it was way later in life that I realized that what an idiot I had been. Instead of being afraid, which I think is a natural reaction. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but if you have, you'll know exactly why I was terrified. But anyway, if I had been even given it a moment's more thought, but I was 16. I mean, a 16-year-old male, please. But the reaction was fear. I was terrified. And the reason I bring it up here is because I think it's a good metaphor for honestly what you are advocating for. By the way, which I agree with and I support. I absolutely think that we have gotten out of balance. I think we need to get back in balance. The only way to be in balance is to have these parameters. The end of that story was that's ultimately when I started like reading the Tao and trying to figure out, okay, so I want X, Y, and Z, what do I got to do? And what I had to do was have a balance. I'm a quant, for God's sakes. I took that entire side and looked at it and thought, my human programming, I'm not going to be able to conquer that. No way. It amusingly left me toward being the most analytical of investors. But you're also, in a way, which people don't really understand. Quants are really the only people who are saying, we're not smarter than the market. We're not smarter than the collective wisdom of every investor. And so you know what we're going to do? In a way, if you wanted to really like go for us, go for our throats, you'd say, you're fucking free riders, man. What you're doing is you are just using the results of those endless hours that analysts put in and everything else and distilled into numbers and then aggregated, and you are horrible because you're not pulling your weight. I look at it the other way and I'm like, no, I know that there's no way I can be smarter than the market. Are there people like George Soros with this famous back problem? Of course. Of course there are. There are artists. Absolutely. I totally believe in them. I just happen not to be one of those. And so I think the other thing a quant is very willing to do is accept failure rates. The reason I bring this up is because I think it does fit in with a broader theme that your thesis is speaking to, which is that things that like hit you like a wave, they're terrifying to an individual person. Having experienced it, I can attest to that. Number two, we have built a society where it's almost a crime to be wrong, in quotes, wrong. And that is so foolish and so short-sighted that a lot of the things that you are advocating for, and I am too, by the way, let's make that very clear, they're scary.
I mean, what are we talking about here? I read a resonant quote 2 days ago. Wisdom is knowing what information is important. It's like, well, that's simple and incredibly profound. And to go back to the user illusion example, you can't take in 11 million bits. You'd be burnt out like a light bulb in a nuclear reactor. You can't take in 1 trillion bits. You'd be jello. All this is about is all we're talking about is how do you calibrate your filter to get the full range of human experience, including the shit stuff, which is the problem, is that if you hide in your intellect, as a lot of people I know have, it's typically a coping mechanism to prevent yourself from experiencing the full range of human emotion. And if you do get blown open, a blowing open experience tends to be incapacitating and overwhelming. And that's the point. You're not supposed to have a direct experience of that. Too many crazy psychedelic experiences make you too open. You believe everything. You need a good filter. And that's the definition of wisdom. And I think the George Soros example is brilliant. For those of you that don't know the George Soros anecdote, it was that he used to give all these really clever retroactive reasons why he did things. And then his son gave an interview, I think, to the Irish Times, where he was like, oh, no, it's just his back hurts.
Right.
When his portfolio is positioned wrong. And I thought about that for a long time, a long, long time. And my interpretation of it, whether right or wrong, is that we lay down a whole bunch of information from pattern recognition. And he laid down a whole bunch of information from seeing an enormous number of different trading scenarios play out. Those pattern recognition patterns run in the background, because if they're running in the foreground, you're not going to get anything done. You're going to be using your 60-bit consciousness to act in the world. But when something trips that, because it's not running in your intellect, it's running in your unconscious, you're going to feel it as a sensation first. And that's the point. You need to be smart enough. Well, smart's completely the wrong word, but you need to be in tune enough and embodied enough that when you feel that, you don't just feel it and discount it. You feel it and know what it means. So you're serving the correct emotions. You're serving the correct physical sensations to your consciousness, and then you're able to interpret them and act on them in the correct way. That is a well-calibrated filter. It's not about feeling everything all the time, because then you're just going to be mush.
Correct. What you have to do, which is very hard to do, which most people struggle with. I wrote a piece that proved to be pretty popular called The Thinker and the Prover, which of course is technically completely wrong, because it says that your brain is divided into the thinker and the prover. So the thinker can think anything it wants, and then the prover takes that as reality and proves it. But it gets back to also this whole idea of co-creating. When you ultimately do read Jed McKenna, oh man, you're going to be intolerable. But that'll be good. We'll be able to have a lot of really fun talks. But the thing that he warns about, which is so true, which is be careful what you ask the universe for. Because if you are genuine in this request, the universe is likely to give it to you. But you know what? The universe is also going to turn you into the instrument that can achieve that. The example that he gave was the making of Apocalypse Now. The documentary on that is actually better than the movie, because he went through the real apocalypse. He literally contemplated suicide. He had to finance the film for himself. He was broke. No one believed in him. The universe broke him down, rebuilt him, and said, oh, by the way, now you're going to be able to make that movie Apocalypse Now. And it will be an achievement. I mean, personally, I think it's his greatest movie. As much as I love The Godfather, it's a soap opera, really, if you break it down. Apocalypse Now, which is based on The Heart of Darkness, it's kind of about what we're talking about right now. It's about unbridled parts of our nature being let run wild. We don't want that to happen because then you get really bad shit happening. But the thing that I think that we should focus on is if we do anything for anyone, it's only going to make sense if they go, hey, did you hear that podcast with Tom and Jim? Yeah, that was a really good thesis. I'm going to start thinking about that, and I'm going to start trying to become more balanced. To me, that's like the biggest win in the world. Let's say you get a chance to give this course at Columbia or wherever, NYU. Do you think, A, you could do it? B, I know what your reading list would look like, so that'd be pretty cool. And I'm asking this honestly. How many people do you think that you can truly teach in a way that they change themselves?
Don't think it matters. And that's the crazy thing, is that if everything I've said is consistent, which again, it may not be, I may be misproven next week, is that it's the butterfly effect. It would be nice if I got tenure and became a professor and reached an audience of millions with this message. But maybe you just reach one person and that one person becomes Nelson Mandela or something, assuming this isn't complete bullshit in the first part. And I do think about my wife. Every time I write for my wife and her one raised eyebrow. Every time I try and talk to her about any of this nonsense, because she's so practical and so much more successful than me and just never got lost in the same way that I got lost. I want to address something, and I think it's interesting that you pick Apocalypse Now, because that, I believe, is an adaptation of Heart of Darkness. It's a story about what he wanted, which is not a coincidence. It makes me think of the Midas myth. Everything he touched turned to gold until he tried to drink things, and then his children turned to gold. And everyone's like, oh, stupid Midas, until we realize we're all Midas. And I think of the David Foster Wallace quote that if you worship anything that isn't the Tao, or whatever horrible word you want to use for it, it will eat you alive. And there's this absolutely terrifying, overlong, typical piece from Scott Siskin, the guy that writes Slate Star Codex, called Meditations on Moloch. It gives me chills, and I'm not even sure why. It's basically about what maximum competition looks like, the Squid Games-like mentality, which I think we're all understanding now, where we worship the market. And there's nothing wrong with the market, but when it's the only thing you worship, it gets you in trouble. And Moloch is the god of child sacrifice. And it gets deeper and much, much darker than that. But basically the idea being that you give up that which is most valuable to you in exchange for power. And the implication being that if you wish for the wrong thing, you'll get the power, but it will take something of extraordinary value from you. And I think the idea being that this is incredibly deep idea that sacrifice is real. It's not a symbolic act, that there is a form of sacrifice, and there's a form of psychological sacrifice that you can make in order to create something of value. And I think that maybe is part of the hero myth as well, is that this person is willing to put himself in a state of extraordinary psychological dissonance and suffering to bring something new into reality that's worthwhile. So instead of sacrificing his child for gold, he sacrifices himself for everyone else.
Yeah, that leads us to probably yet another podcast, because that leads to the discussion between, if you do become enlightened, most people, if you look at the Jed McKinnons of the world, or Buddha himself, Buddha never wrote anything down. I think that that's very important for people to understand. Neither did Jesus Christ. These incredible prophets or enlightened beings never, ever wrote anything down. You should think about that deeply, because what you're getting are those that venerate and worship them, not necessarily what they said. You don't want to do that. It's like the Zen story about the guy, I think it's actually from Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Anyway, it's the story of this guy who was seeking enlightenment. And so he keeps going to the various monasteries and everything. And he learns and he learns and he learns, but he just keeps going. until he finally gets to the one at the top of the very highest mountain that he's ever been on. And there he's met by the master, and he starts talking to him, and, oh, this is amazing. And he asks the master, did any of your pupils ever leave here? And the master says, yes, but only one. And he was a bit bitter when he said it. And the Zen character says, which way did he go? And he points, and he gets up without saying anything and goes that way. The point is that there's so many ways that we try to make this clear. It's so difficult to make clear. What you want is the idea. What you want is the ability to go through that kind of hero's journey. But one of the things that is an equally likely outcome is that Jed McKenna wrote a great piece about if you were to instantly become enlightened. He said you would become immediately a Taoist sage, and you would also immediately and concurrently not care about power, about money, about outward appearances, about virtually anything. We kind of know that Buddha kind of said. He didn't rouse the troops, so to speak. That was all of his followers. But there's a second way, which is that way of what is called the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is what you're talking about, which is the hero who becomes enlightened but goes back. I'm interested in the bodhisattvas of the world because they're the Prometheans, I believe. They are the ones that are bringing the fire. By the way, my good friend Dan Jeffries, who's written excellent essays on this about enlightenment and specifically looking at Jed. In Jed's most recent stuff, he says, enlightenment, true enlightenment, is actually the booby prize, man. What you want is to become a human adult. And what a human adult is someone who is awake in the dream state. But that is also what a bodhisattva is. They don't give up. They care enough about their fellow human beings to become Prometheans, bringing the fire back. That's what I think you're advocating for. And I think that makes great sense.
There's a really, really interesting multi-level conceptualization of this. So McGilchrist has this idea where the way that we interact with the world is that there's this massive flow of information going past us that we can't interact with unless we divide it up into parts and categories so that we can articulate it and understand it. But then we put it back into the flow afterwards. It's like someone listening to a piece of music, deconstructing it into notes, and then playing it intuitively and beautifully afterwards. And what we've done as a society is been unbelievably good at passing things down into the individual notes, but to build them back up again requires magic and emergence. And it's super interesting to me that in reading about shamanic cultures, it wasn't that the shaman fell apart that mattered. It was how they reconstituted themselves afterwards, that they effectively became bodhisattva or human adults. And rationality, pure rationality, dark Jed McKenna rationality. I read the first book, by the way, and I was like, this does not sound desirable at all. And I kind of missed the point because the second two parts are about how you build yourself back up, right?
Right.
It's about participation. If you give Western science any of these ideas, they'll be like, you'll take a cow, and science gets out the scalpel and divides it into a bunch of piles of beef. And you're like, there's a cow there. And they're like, nope, there's just some beef. And in order for you to bring that beef back, there needs to, as I said, be magic. And the way that Joseph Campbell put it was that basically you go away and you learn the craft. That's why it's not just at 12 years old going away and following your bliss. You have to learn the craft. You have to put in the time. There has to be a foundation. You learn the craft, and then you will end up playing it intuitively, like the martial artist who does the wax on, wax off, and then brings something new into the world. And that's what the bodhisattva does. And I think if Jesus allegedly said this or not, but in the Gospel of Thomas, if you bring forth what is inside you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is inside you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. That's the idea, is you bringing forth this latent creativity. And the only way you can bring forth that creativity is, one, the subjugation of the ego, and two, aligning yourself with the system. And to go back to your original point, that means there's something to align yourself with. There's something that's real that exists outside of us, where not everything is abstract, not everything is debatable. There are real things, and you can align yourself with them, and you will know when you're aligned with them because you will see coincidences and you will be offered gifts back.
Absolutely. And that, in a nutshell, is the explanation of human adulthood, the Tao, and of these things that we seem to have been grasping at, that guys 3,000 or 4,000 years ago figured out. What I absolutely love, I've been incredibly fortunate in life in a number of experiences I've been able to have. So I was sitting in on a presentation by a genius quantum physicist, and literally, as I'm listening to him, I'm just like, okay, what he's saying here is he's translated the Tao Te Ching into numbers. What's also interesting is when I have a chance to actually talk to some of these people. I mean, literally, one of the first books that got me interested in quantum physics was called The Dancing Wu Li Masters. And I haven't reread it. It was written a long time ago, but they converge. And the final thing that I wanted to get out, because I think it's really important, is this idea. This is Tony DeMello again, and he's saying, when you fight with something, you're tied to it forever. And it puts you out of alignment with the flow of the Tao. If you decide, no, that's wrong, this is right, I'm going to swim this way. Go ahead, give it a try. But you're probably going to make yourself, again, what he would say, suffering is caused by clashing with reality. I'm saying the Tao, the flow of the Tao, is reality. And many people say, oh, well, that's crazy talk. Well, not really. I love your idea of you'll see all of these synchronicities back as gifts that are telling you that you're going in the right direction. That is so true. I cannot tell you how true that is, because in my own life, I found just the number of so-called synchronicities is just like, oh, okay. I don't believe that. But then the minute you try to be honest and forthright about that, you're talking to a materialist who is 100% intellect. Well, that's a very hard person to try to convince, because listeners, Tom shrugged his shoulders, and that's what I do all the time too. It's kind of like, listen, the final step, I think, is that if you ever get even close to there, that's what you got to do, because all you're doing, like Prometheus, right? Here's the fire, have at it, do with it what you want. It can be incredibly good. You can use it to warm yourself and do all these things, or you can burn shit to the ground. It can be very bad. It's not like we're saying that any of this is cut and dried. This is the only way. No, not at all. But understand you do, and that's why I love the metaphors. By the way, one other thing that makes it easy for people, there are a group of movies that are like so amazing. I've got a list on Twitter. I'll put it up when we release this podcast. But there's a new one which has literally blown me away, and it's called Free Guy. And Free Guy is remarkable in that it is the most Zen, Buddha, Taoist movie I've ever seen in my life. And yet it is 100% a commercial popcorn Hollywood movie that manages to make this point. And the reason I'm bringing it up now is because I'm going back to the beginning of our conversation with you say, look at the stories that are coming out. When you said that, I was like, oh God, I've got to talk about Free Guy, because you're right. All of a sudden, everything and the stories, if all you do is pay attention to those, I mean, if I was like a macro investor, which I don't think you can be because complex adaptive systems, all change comes from the bottom, not the top. And the quote I gave you, the Oppenheimer quote, which I love. Yeah, of course the world's going to hell. The only possible way that we can do to make that not happen is to not try and make it not happen. So it's just like, it is so contrary to our Western methods of thought that an awakening is a good term for it. Well, my friend, I see that we are at the hour and a half mark. And when I go beyond an hour and a half, Jamie sent me a text and said, I love how you always use me as the bad guy. He says, you call me a school marm, and like, how can you be so young and yet be such an old fogey? But I think things take as much time as they need. One thing that I would like to tell the audience, though, and it's a compliment to Tom, synthesizing data is really fucking hard. You take something that's really hard, but then add on top of it, you got to be able to choose which data you want to synthesize. That, my friends, is even harder. But here's another thing that I think listeners really want to pay attention to and listen closely to. Synthesizers like Tom are the future. If you want to do really, 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 really well in the new world, information, not enough. We're in an information tsunami, and it is enough to blast us out. You've got to be able to have the selectivity to understand what is worth it and what is not. And then you got to be able to synthesize it and create new understanding. That is a gift that you, my friend, have. You've come up with this incredibly good theory. How do we make this relatable to investment advice?
Well, firstly, I don't care where it goes next, because that would be a contradiction of my entire thesis. I don't have a 1 week plan, let alone a 5-year plan. There's a couple of things to say first. I'm very, very, very flattered about what you say about synthesis, but really only something I've realized in the last 2 weeks about synthesis is that you tend to think about synthesis as sort of like a thing that certain people do. But if you paid attention to what we've been talking about, if you do your own synthesis of what you think is important, you will become wiser, because you yourself will start chipping away at what's important to you. There's a great, great quote I love from a Japanese designer called Yohei Yamamoto, where he says, start by copying what you love. Copy, 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 copy. And at the end of the copy, you will find yourself. And the idea being that if you follow your interests and you don't try and create, you just assemble pieces from other people, at the end of that process, as something Nietzsche said as well, you will find maybe what's driving your soul, that all of those pieces that you've pulled apart will come back together. And that thing that comes back together is you. Because otherwise you get into this deeply paradoxical situation where you're trying really, really hard. Like, what do I love? What do I love? How do I follow my bliss? How do I follow my bliss? And you're just putting it back in the left hemisphere again, and you're trying to take hold of the steering wheel. So you have this really awkward, incredibly difficult, paradoxical situation where you have to not think very much about what you love. You just have to you have to pay subtle attention to what's driving your interests and then follow those rabbit holes. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it.
Right.
I think for the investment advice, and obviously nothing I say is investment advice, particularly from me.
Nor anything I say. Let's get that very clear.
So I ran into a great geopolitical strategist who I've been following for a while called Marco Papic, and he talks about this emergent shift in voters towards more government intervention. If Squid Games represents something, I think it does, it's the understanding that we need more slack in the system. And slack is just as easily translatable as love as anything else. It's capacity, and that we're going to see more intervention and we're going to see more stimulus, because that makes the system a little less punitive. And I was thinking today, looking at this insane Shiba Inu stat about this guy that turned $8,000 into 5.7 billion. If it's true, I don't know if it isn't, but it's like the idea of this emergent decentralization of wealth, however it ends up playing out. And crypto and blockchain may not be the way, but NFTs, artists are making as much money as speculators. And that must be the first bubble as ever, the first time in a bubble ever. But if you think about McGilchrist, I would be studying, what does the right hemisphere want? How does it see the world? And then thinking about the ways that will manifest itself in markets. And I've written about this a lot, so people can check it out on our website in sort of a lot more detail. And it's something that I'm going to be, there's literally nothing more interesting than this. So I'm going to be dedicating my life to it for the next few years. But that's sort of the way that I'd be thinking about things.
I agree. The challenge that I have is that I think it's difficult to ignite curiosity. One of my thoughts that I've been thinking a lot about is, what are the commonalities of people that I've met? And again, I've been so lucky to be able to have met extraordinary people. Everyone's going to say survivorship bias. Well, okay, yeah. But that shouldn't stop us from looking at what we see as commonalities. And one is that I've noticed, I don't know that it's flattering, but they're obsessive. Not to a point of obsessive OCD, but they are obsessive. And when you're curious, you don't really have a choice. When you're curious and you are driven by curiosity, what I can tell you is that you really don't have a choice, but oh my, what a wonderful life you can create for yourself. And so sometimes I get distraught when I just see behavior that I just know where it's going to end up. You can't really say anything because you're not going to be able to change human nature at its core. You can make it a little bit better, I guess. I guess at the margin. That's also the concept of being the butterfly, which I fully agree with, by the way. Last plug I'll give before we say goodbye is to Bob Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I've reread many, many times. And the reason I thought about it today was I was thinking about the Jungian idea of the charioteer. And it was not lost on me that that came from Plato's dialogue with Phaedrus, which is what Bob Persig calls his earlier self in the book. And of course, his earlier self was a genius who literally got to this place, but then went insane, or so society said. And what he talks about, McGilchrist would say it's the left and right hemisphere. Persig would call the classicist and the romantic. And he would say that there is forever the knife. And the knife is what we're trying to gently suggest here, at least this is my interpretation. The knife's going to get used because it is, because we're human beings, and because that, frankly, is how we progress. We invent new things and we figure them out and we get problems and then we have to figure those out. But it's like if you think of only the knife, you're not thinking about it right. So, kind sir, I think that this is great stuff. You know what we'll probably have to do, which might be fun, actually. I think we're going to do this, though, aren't we? We're going to do it in a salon, right? That's your salon. I'm just going to be a bystander there, right?
No, we wouldn't have a salon without you. Probably first week of December, maybe the second on Intellect.
Anna, you owe us big time because we are just plugging the hell out of you. But that's actually exciting because that will allow for a bunch of questions that you and I haven't thought about, I'm sure. The salon format is real. I've done 2 as the speaker, and they're fun. Well, my friend, as always, I come away with probably more questions than I had before I came. You've thrown me into a recursive loop. I won't be any good to anyone for the rest of today because all I'm going to be doing is thinking about this. But that's, I think, the highest compliment I can give you, Tom. Thank you for throwing me into this recursive loop. I hope that many of our listeners are in the same loop, but it's not going to be an infinite loop, guys. We're going to break out of it. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.